Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, here with some post-fight thoughts on James Toney's loss to Denis Lebedev. Now, first, a confession. I only saw the last few rounds of the fight. I picked up a UK feed on the fight, and so by the time I got to the fight, I was listening to the announcers basically say that James Toney, who I thought would lose the fight. I have a pre-fight video up where I picked Denis Lebedev. I was listening to UK announcers basically say that James Toney should never fight again. He's finished, right? There was even some question on whether the referee or Toney's own corner, Buddy McGirt, would actually allow James Toney to finish the fight, right? Now, let me just say this. You know, here is where gamblers can make money, right? James Toney, and I picked against him. I didn't buy the weight loss, the weigh-in at 199, Toney being fit. I didn't buy any of that storyline, right? I think I even mentioned it in my George Groves video. But Toney's far from finished. I believe that what all of us should do is literally make a note to ourselves. If you're a gambler and you have a gambling notebook with your thoughts and observations, make a note to yourself that if James Toney fights a much taller opponent, not a guy his height, not a guy in the 5'11 range like Lebedev, but fights a taller opponent who has foot speed problems, Toney would actually do vastly better than he did against Denis Lebedev. Not only that, let's remember, Toney has never been knocked out. And in this fight, Toney was not knocked out, right? I believe in my pre-fight video, even I said that there was a chance that Lebedev would get a late knockout, right? All I can say, though, is he didn't. And Toney was actually still moving late in the fight. Quite frankly, and I know I'm going to sound like a crackpot, maybe I am a crackpot, but James Toney, with his current fight style, would actually do better against Vladimir Klitschko, who moves less than Denis Lebedev, than he would against Denis Lebedev, right? Make another note to yourself. Denis Lebedev, and I understand his reputation is as a puncher, and he does have a great punch. But Denis Lebedev is actually quite nimble on his feet. And that was the difference in this fight. In other words, Lebedev has foot speed, doesn't need to plant that much before getting off shots. In fact, in the few rounds that I saw this fight, there were times when Lebedev actually looked a bit like Manny Pacquiao. In other words, he's able to get to spots, he's able to throw hard punches, he's able to pivot, he's able to literally get behind his opponent. There were several times when Toney was turned around and Lebedev was able to hit Toney with body shots, right? Lebedev, who I thought beat Marco Huck, is actually underrated at cruiser, right? I believe Lebedev beats most of the guys at cruiser, right? Now let's talk about James Toney. You know, James Toney, from the waist up, is excellent. You know, even in this fight, James Toney is bending. James Toney actually had Lebedev time. Toney is rolling with punches, right? Toney's very flexible at his waist. He could actually duck under punches. Yes, this is the same James Toney who just lost by wide unanimous decision, and rightly so, against Denis Lebedev. But above the waist, Toney is still excellent. Where Toney fails, and it's a big failure, is below the waist, right? Toney can't move. He's stationary. He doesn't have the foot speed. Against movers, someone like Roy Jones, I think he loses by a wide margin, right? Because guys who can move around the ring, like Denis Lebedev, are able to literally outmaneuver him. In other words, Toney would beat most if he could fight you in a phone booth. But the minute you introduce movement around the ring, Toney is lost, right? The other part where Toney fails is Toney can't handle a mobile opponent who can pivot him and hit him to his body. In other words, Lebedev was excellent. Rather than waste a lot of time on Toney's head, Lebedev figured out that while Toney could move his head and roll his shoulders, he couldn't move his body because he's stationary. So Lebedev was able to land several body shots on him. Now, what does this mean? This means that James Toney shouldn't be fighting 5'11". What James Toney should be doing is fighting 6'5", right? He needs a tall guy. Taller guys typically can't move as well. I understand there are exceptions. Alexander Dimitrenko moves awfully well for a big man, right? But taller guys usually don't move as well as shorter guys. And the bottom line is a tall guy who is going to have problems reaching down on Toney, who himself is bending at the waist, is going to have a very hard time reaching Toney's body or hitting Toney in the head, right? And Toney, his reflexes have dimmed, but he's still an elite counterpuncher. So against a tall guy who doesn't move that well, or who rather doesn't use movement that well, in other words, a tall guy relying on a jab to create distance, not his feet, but a jab to create distance, Toney would be able to slip that jab. The whole fight would be about upper body movement. It wouldn't be about Toney's dismal lack of foot movement and inability to move around the ring, right? So given that the heavyweight division, Vladimir Klitschko's still out there, I understand that fight's probably not financially viable right now. But given that there are other big guys out there, Marius Wack comes to mind, right? Kevin McBride. You have a bunch of big guys, Michael Grant, right? You have a bunch of big guys in the heavyweight division who are 6'4" and up, right? Just think about someone like Michael Grant who can't move around the ring, right? Kevin McBride, no foot speed. My point to you is, if I'm James Toney, I stay away from the Roy Joneses. I stay away from the Steve Cunninghams. I stay away from the Antonio Tarvers, right? I believe James Toney is better. He was dead at the weight. He's better at heavy than he is cruiserweight, right? He's been at heavy since 2003, right? He destroyed Evander Holyfield at heavy. If I'm James Toney, I stay at heavy. I don't skip any meals. I'm at the restaurant eating ribeye steak. I'm ordering dessert. I'm treating myself well, right? I'm keeping the weight on. And then what I'm doing is I'm watching for possible opponents below the waist, right? I'm looking below the waist. I'm looking for a tall guy who can't move that well, right? And then what I want to do is I want to challenge that tall guy, and then I want to go in the ring, slip his jab, make the fight about upper body, right? Tony Thompson has just been named the mandatory challenger for Vladimir Klitschko's belt. You know what? And I know boxing fans know that Tony Thompson's fight with Vladimir, right, where Thompson got stopped, Thompson actually was dominating that fight, believe it or not, or at least winning that fight according to CompuBox numbers. Take a look at those numbers. They're significant. If Tony Thompson were to beat Vladimir Klitschko, and that fight is closer than people realize, if Thompson were to beat Vladimir Klitschko, if I'm James Toney, I challenge Tony Thompson for the heavyweight title, right? Because style-wise, Toney matches up well with Tony Thompson. In other words, James Toney, for all of his problems, for the fact that he got dominated by an underrated Denis Lebedev, right? For all of his problems, UK announcers saying, I wouldn't pay to see James Toney again. For all of his problems, if he picks a slow-footed, tall guy who operates behind a jab, who will have a problem reaching for Toney or hitting Toney's body or dealing with Toney's upper body movement, and who couldn't outmaneuver him in the ring, James Toney would have a chance in that fight. Toney lost wide margin. He looked awful losing it. You know what? Above the waist, he still has it against the right opponent. At the end of the day, styles make fights. Let me know what you think. I know I'm sounding like a loon now. I'll tell you what. I know I'm writing in my little book. James Toney against a slow-footed, tall opponent, worth a look, right? I'm curious to see who James Toney fights next. Hopefully, one of these tall, slow-footed heavyweights will view Toney as an easy payday, and then James might be back in business. Let me know what you think. Leave your comments for me here on YouTube. Visit us at gamblersadvisory.com. Thanks for watching.